Good morning. This is Chapter 4, The Genes of Gregoria, May 10th, 1988. Dear Sasha, your poignant and sentient letter left me with a feeling of guilt and helplessness. Perhaps you and Luba should collaborate on a book of your own. I am sure that it would be well received. You must tell Luba that no one here judges her except to think of her as a hero. Many women here are taught not to resist violent rapists because it is life-threatening to do so. It took great courage to supply information to the partisans in the face of certain death. I look forward to meeting her, and I wish that you would tell her that the entire Truskoff family is proud of her. When I was counseling young men about the military draft, I always warned them that a question the draft boards would ask young pacifists was, what if someone was about to rape your mother? Would you fight for her? The question does not deserve an answer, and the draftees could counter with a half hour of questions of their own, such as, how big was the rapist? Was he armed? Was he alone? Did he speak English? Could he be talked out of his crime? After a while, the draft boards began to realize that no one could truly recreate such a situation and put himself in it, and know how he would act. Fear and courage come and go, as all instincts do. But they only relate to intellect when the choices do not narrow down to fighting back or death. When I was 17, I would speed home from school on my bicycle, wolf down a sandwich, and then race off to football practice or baseball or whatever sport was in season. Athletic competition was the coverall blanket that I used to pull over my head to hide the complexes and shut out the world. You, Sasha, were already in the middle of a war. I was never a good student. I was dismayed at the very shallow approach the teachers took towards history and other subjects. My favorite class was called Problems of American Democracy. It was an experimental program of student debates. You can imagine how lively it became for me. The war in Europe created a new need for American goods, especially military hardware. Factories were rehiring, and my father was back at work redecorating homes because Americans again had the money to spend. My parents did not think that the environment in the Polish-dominated town was good for my sister because they had clung to the old country ways and were not assimilating fast enough for my parents. We moved back into that very conservative town where even the families on welfare had green lawns in front of their homes. Our politics didn't change, so I was a misfit from the start. The town was an above-average income suburb of New York, and many residents commuted to work by train and ferry into the big city. The German-American Bund, a Hitler-supported group, was very well patronized in the area, and anti-Semitism was widespread. I was not a happy teenager. My school days always started wrong. I had to say the pledge to the flag. That I didn't mind at all, because I had patriotism from my 1-inch haircut to my raggedy sneakers. But then we had to say the Lord's Prayer and give the Bible reading. Children in American public schools do not have to do that anymore, but then we were forced to, and I always had a problem with it. It seemed to me that each time it came to be my turn to read from the Bible, my teacher would choose the 23rd Psalm, part of which reads, The ungodly are not so. They are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. I could always feel that old woman's eyes in my back as I read because she felt that I was one of her ungodly students. At home in the evening, I would listen to my father interpret the news. He had a simple theory about Western ammunition makers fomenting a world war and building armies of other nations just for profit. He was the only person in our circle of friends who seemed happy to hear of the 1939 pact between the Soviet Union and Hitler's Germany, and he was elated with the short-term results. As the youngest member of the family, I was the only one who had the time to sit and listen as he explained the military importance of Poland. The generals, he said, it gave the generals the gateway to Russia. Our Polish friends were not so elated. I can remember one time after Papa had discussed the subject with a couple of his Polish, Russian-American contemporaries who did not agree with him. He took the time to give me a history lesson on Polish-Russian relations from the time that Catherine put her lover Poniatowski on the throne in Warsaw to rule the Poles for her. It was his impression that the Polish government was no longer in control of its nation's destiny, in 1939 anyway. He told me that there were many anti-Semites in Poland who would fight with the Nazis against the Bolsheviks with the Jewish heads. We all had developed an unfortunate and unfair stereotype of the Polish people. Those anti-Semitic minds, according to my father, were controlled by the church. John Truskoff read 3 newspapers thoroughly every day and listened intently to the major newscasts on the radio. We had a Russian-language newspaper delivered by mail. The local paper dropped at our doorstep, and Papa always brought home the New York Times. He tried to get us to ignore the vicious propaganda about the pact. Taking my school geography book, he pointed to a map and explained why he felt that the time-saving device was a smart move by Stalin. I can still see that very large, tan finger moving across the map. See, he said, the fascists in Finland must be dealt with first. Then there is the Japanese in the north. Uncle Joe has to slow the war plans down. Uncle Joe has to slow the war plans of the West down. He cannot handle them now. There are 5 Nazi divisions in Finland already. Sasha, it was so hard for the American political left to accept any rationale for a pact with a madman in Berlin. For a time, I began to understand how my German-American peers felt, because the media here rejoiced in the fact that they could lump Hitler's Germany and the Bolsheviks of Stalin together. They gleefully published the pictures of Molotov signing the pact with Ribbentrop and a smiling Stalin standing behind them. The entire American left, including the Communist Party, was devastated by the news of the pact. They linked Hitlerism with the French, British, and anti-American anti-Semites and anti-socialist crusaders, and the sight of Ribbentrop and Molotov together fragmentized the left so severely that even today, a half-century later, it has not fully recovered. My father thought of himself as an American, and his family as an American family. That is how he raised us. But his mind was a Russian creation, and always remained as such. Like most astute Russian people, he was preoccupied with the idea of capitalist encirclement of his homeland, and was quick to point out that the move of the Red Army into Ukraine and western Byelorussia was a strategy to establish a military position for the coming invasion. He would point a finger at me and say, "Stalin knows what he is doing. He does not put his enemies in categories A and category B. If they are enemies, then that's what they are, and he must deal with them in his own way, and the way that is best for the Soviet Union, not the American Communist Party." I think that in those years he was still thinking of the strong socialist movement in Germany, and that the German left would somehow get Hitler before the invasion. When the bomb exploded in Munich, killing 6 others, but not Hitler, John shook his head at the radio and said, "They'll get him yet." You can see why schoolwork at the time was very dull for me. Teachers did not and would not allow discussion in any depth. They parroted the press. That was as courageous as they would get. If not forgivable, it was at the very least understandable. The American press, anti-Soviet propaganda, built to a crescendo at the end of the 30s. No matter how bad reports of the fascist atrocities were, the press always tried to top them with screaming negative headlines about the Soviet Union. I was conditioned to it because my parents took the time to explain it all to me before my teenage years. But most of the parents of my fellow students believed every word and conveyed their own brainwashing to their children, thus isolating me in the class debates. My father saved headlines such as those that appeared in the Hearst papers like the Chicago Tribune. Soviets fight famine as grain myth explodes. Starving poor threatens the doom of the Soviets. Russians free to rob, starve, and murder. Secret report shows Russia near collapse. These were just a few of the headlines. Other papers joined in the infusion of outlandish propaganda into the minds of receptive Americans. They drank it in with their nickel beer. It also helped them to have a better attitude towards the economic morass that their own country was in. Millions of Americans had already lost confidence in the system, and they desperately needed something or someone that they could feel superior to. The false economy of the 20s had convinced them that the system not only worked, but was also foolproof. Socialism, they were told, is the satanic attempt by the ungodly to destroy our way of life. When the economy, built on a mountain of worthless paper, collapsed in 1929, and the ensuing poverty crushed the middle class, even the upper middle class lost their arrogance and gave way to despair. Without the rich and famous being paraded about to sell the American dream, propagandists turned from a positive to a very negative approach. Instead of trumpeting the success of America, they fanned the flames of hatred, and the result were the labor goons attacking strikers who may have been their own neighbors, but they were painted red by the press. Undisguised terrorism was let loose in the land. Hired thugs who broke up union meetings were only following the lead of the press and the United States Congress. In 1938, a special investigative committee was formed in the House of Representatives to investigate un-American activities. The chairman of the committee was Martin Dies. The congressman from Texas hired a chief investigator named Edward F. Sullivan. That appointment alone told most thinking Americans exactly what the committee was going to be. Mr. Sullivan had already been arrested 9 times on charges that included larceny, drunkenness, sodomy, and impersonating an FBI officer. This was the man who was going to investigate American citizens and determine if their actions were un-American. I can remember relating this part of our history to a group of students, and it became obvious to me during the question period that they had difficulty believing it. I had to document it for them. Sasha, I am sure that when Soviet citizens first learned the truth of Stalin's purges, that they had the same problem. We are all products of the media unless we are endowed with the intellectual fortitude to resist. The truth is that Chief Investigator Sullivan brought an expert witness to testify against anyone that the committee wanted to prosecute. The so-called experts were Alvin Halpern, who was sent to prison for larceny even before he finished his testimony; Peter J. Ines, a professional labor spy who was sent to prison for the attempted rape of a small child. There was William C. McCuston, an enforcer hired to break strikes. He was himself murdered after he was indicted for murder by the court. William T. Gurney, who was soon exposed as another management agent sent in to infiltrate and spy on the unions. Edward Perry Banta, an admitted member of a pro-Nazi organization who died in jail while serving a sentence for a felony crime. John Koos, a man who sent a telegram to Hitler congratulating him for his history-making efforts in the area of human rights. Koos was also a member of the infamous Hetman's Organization, a fascist Ukrainian group. Richard Krebs, who came to the United States after serving in the German Gestapo and had also served 39 months in San Quentin prison. Perhaps the most distinguished witness of this band of blackguards was Walter Steele. He was the editor of the fanatical right-wing pro-Father Coughlin publication, The National Republic. Now, Sasha, I must give you the punchline to this bizarre affair in American history. Congressman Thomas, a member of the committee and a very outspoken member, later became the chairman of the committee. He spewed the anti-communist venom everywhere, but he was later convicted of defrauding the U.S. government and sent to prison. Young Americans like myself had to decide who were the real Americans and who were the un-Americans. I knew that my parents were real Americans. They were fighting for equality and justice for all people. So the enemy had to be the government of the United States. After all, that bunch of felons and murderers represented the U.S. government? It was all a shattering experience for a teenage patriot who was living in a conservative town and wanted more than anything to belong, as most teenagers do. I found myself becoming more withdrawn with each passing day and each damning headline that attempted to drive a wedge between my country and my family. The House Un-American Activities Committee continued its program of political derangement into the mid-40s. The quality of its members did not improve. While the Soviet Union and the United States were allied in the Great War, the committee was sort of dormant. But when the last shot was fired and the hot war became the Cold War, the committee was revitalized. Listen to a few sentences taken from the congressional record. I am sure that it would be hard for students to believe that some of the new members were worse than the old. Congressman Rankin of the state of Mississippi, in questioning that old rogue and international playboy William C. Bullitt, asked Rankin, "They are just like human slaves in Russia, aren't they?" Bullitt, "There are more human slaves in Russia than have existed anywhere in the world." Rankin, "You said that 60% of the communists in America were aliens. Now what percent of that is Jews?" No answer. "Is it true, Mr. Bullitt, that the communists went into the southern states and picked up niggers and sent them to Moscow to teach them how to blow up bridges?" "Yes, Sasha, that is taken directly from the record of the United States Congress." That kind of public diatribe continued on into the 50s and the 60s, to the great joy of the media. Edward R. Murrow, the world-renowned journalist, was one of the few with a national platform that spoke out in opposition, but he had to pay such a high price for his courage that few would follow his lead. The committee personnel never did improve in quality. One of the investigators and a member of the committee was Richard Milhouse Nixon, and one of the star witnesses was Ronald Reagan. Each used the committee as a stepping stone on their way to the presidency. The most highly publicized committee chairman was the alcoholic Senator Joseph McCarthy, later censured by the Congress, and the committee lawyer Roy Cohn, who was later disbarred and died of AIDS. Sasha, I think that it's important for me to describe the committee because it left a permanent mark on my family and me. It always blocked my mind from absorbing the belief that I lived in a true democracy. The constant barrage from the Congress and the media created a perpetual turmoil of boiling emotions within me. I loved my family. To me it seemed that all of the rhetoric blowing like a foul wind from that committee room was directed at me and to my family. Because we certainly did sympathize with the citizens who were brought before the committee and who were deprived of their jobs and of their dignity. No one in our family could ever be accused of obsquiescence, and the more the likes of Senator McCarthy pushed, the harder we pushed back. The fear of my father being deported and the fear of being blacklisted or jailed brought us all closer together. I shall ever be thankful to my parents for teaching me how to read a newspaper and separate fact from fiction, and to do my own research on subjects that interested me. I see that as perhaps the most important aspect of my education. I can still remember some of the newspaper articles that my father would clip out and use as examples of propaganda. I kept a few of them for years until they turned yellow and fell apart. His favorite was the one about the Finnish soldiers who carried can openers attached to their belts. They hid in the trees, and when the rickety Soviet tanks went by, they would drop in onto them and pry them open with their can openers and throw the grenades in. When the Red Army started their offensive and began to drive the Nazis from Stalingrad, Big John waved his clippings at us and smiled. "The fascists must have forgotten their can openers," he said. Another prize piece was a published report that the Japanese had run out of material to make engines for their warplanes. Americans were told that huge rubber bands were installed and that the Japanese pilots had to die at the end of their mission because they could not rewind the rubber band to get them home. Students at my school were all repeating that story the next day. As Pop always said, people will believe anything that they want to hear. Is it any wonder that we expected to defeat the Japanese in a week? I found school a terrible bore. I had no real friends, and socializing was something that I had to force myself to do. When the Depression gave way to war preparation, my parents, thinking that they were doing what was best for their children, moved us back into that upper-middle-class town that we had left. I had very little in common with the other students, except my interest in athletics. Their families were wallowing in the new prosperity, but my family was going to demonstrations to stop fascism in Spain. I carried a sign on the New Jersey and New York docks to stop the shipment of scrap iron to Japan. Racism and anti-Semitism haunted me. My peers were obsessed with beer parties and male-female relationships. That, of course, is a normal stage for teenagers of any era, and I must admit that I, and not my fellow students, erected the social barrier. School was as dull for me as watching mud dry. The atrocities being committed against Jews in Europe and the brazen anti-Semitism and contemptible fascism growing in our own country were daily topics at home. Teachers in our school system dared not touch such subjects. I recently heard that American author Gore Vidal criticized the entire education process here. He mentioned the lack of knowledge that American students have of history and geography. A survey taken showed that an alarming number of students could not find their own country on a world map, and when asked, many thought that Africa was one nation. Before World War II, history and geography were among the most important subjects in the school, and I had to be getting passing grades in both before I could participate in sports. Most schools would not allow you to graduate unless you had the credits for those subjects. The war moved young people through training programs as opposed to education programs. The sciences became the most important post-Sputnik subjects. Today, there is a rush to get through high school and college so that money-making postgraduate degrees can be bestowed. Well-trained but poorly educated lawyers, doctors, and business specialists are being turned out by the thousands. Most of them are people who have stayed in training until they can qualify as a specialist in one field or another. A doctor who will treat your sore finger will not look at your toe or anything in between. A person who has a master's degree in business and finance may not be able to find the United States on a world map. An exaggeration? Perhaps, but the point is valid. When I think back to my high school years, I don't remember ever feeling lonely. Besides my interest in sports and music, I loved to read. It was easy for me to relate to the black students and the black community in town. Although my social problems were all self-inflicted, the barriers keeping blacks on the fringe of society was a rigid part of the structure. I spent a good deal of my spare time in the segregated black section of town. We had boxing matches under the streetlights at night and played basketball through the hoop that was attached to a telephone pole. The police kept taking it down, but we always put it right back up. I wanted to get good marks in school that would permit me to go right on to college. I also wanted to play football, but I was a young Jewish boy who was reminded daily of the Nazi menace, and I had my mind set on going into the military. I dreamed, like other boys, of scoring touchdowns, but I also dreamed of capturing Hitler and bringing him home to Bessie Kendall Truskoff. She would know what to do with him. I have thanked my parents for a lot of things, but I never did put enough emphasis on their sense of humor. Without it, none of us would have survived. My father was in favor of my joining the Navy, but my mother was not. I needed her signature to get into the only branch of service that would take me at my age. I can now fully understand her feelings. She knew that her son, who wanted to go and fight against the Nazi anti-Semitism and racism, would be joining the most racist anti-Semitic organization this side of Berlin, the United States Navy. Bessie saw too many problems. Sasha, today, there are black officers in command of Navy ships and black generals in the Army. But then the military was segregated. The first time that I went to join, I was just 16, and I had to lie about my age and bring my mother with me. I can remember it all very clearly. We went to the recruiting section in Paterson, New Jersey, and on the bus, Bessie kept giving me reasons why they should turn me down. "I will tell them you are only 14, she would say with that wry smile. "I will tell them that you are such a clumsy ox you will fall off the ship. I will tell them that you need your mommy to feed you." This went on the whole trip, and when we finally faced the Navy petty officer in charge, Bessie was ready. The poor, balding recruiter, who had many service stripes on his sleeve, did not know what to expect. The first thing that my mother asked him was that if he thought that a Jew should join the U.S. Navy. Red-faced and flustered, he said, "We have Jews in the Navy." "Are there any Jewish officers?" Bessie shot back. "Ma," I begged. "No, no," the recruiter said, smiling at my mother. "I understand her concern. I have been in the Navy for more than 20 years, and I have never seen a kosher meal served." I had a feeling that he was going to send me home, but Mama's laughter relaxed us all. "Kosher meal," she laughed. "He wouldn't know a kosher meal from a football. Do you serve pork chops? That he can eat by the dozen." They both laughed as I squirmed. "Well," said the petty officer, not knowing that he had a legitimate customer, "if he is that kind of a Jew, he will have no trouble. I think that he is a bright young man, but to be honest, I think that he will have less trouble getting promotions if he doesn't put his religion down." "His religion?" Bessie shrieked. "That lummox has no religion." Bewildered, the sailor shook his head. "Listen," he said now, directing his remarks more at Bessie than me. "Where it asks his religion, why doesn't he just put Protestant? No one will force him to go to any services." Bessie poked me in the ribs, and with the gurgling sounds of stifled laughter, she nodded her head. I scribbled Protestant in the space. We laughed and giggled all the way home, but Bessie made me promise that I would not tell anyone what we had done. I received my acceptance notice 1 week later. Today, applications for the military, college, or employment do not ask your religion. Sasha, my military experience was not at all what I had envisioned. I scored very high on my aptitude tests and was offered special training school programs. I refused and asked for sea duty. That is exactly what I got. I was a signalman on a troop transport taking troops and supplies across the Atlantic. I always had clean clothes, a nice clean place to sleep, and plenty of good food. I soon found out that U.S. Navy ship was a microcosm of America in the decade of the 40s. We had African Americans aboard, but the only time that they were permitted above deck was when they were serving the officers. They were given the rating of steward's mate, which was Navy terminology for servant. They cooked and served the officers' meals. To my knowledge, there were no Jewish officers aboard my ship. It was common practice for those of us who worked around the bridge of the ship to pretend that we were officers. We would call down to the steward's mates and simply say, "This is the bridge. I am sending a messenger down for sandwiches and coffee." The messenger, pretending that he was sent by the officer from the bridge, would always return with the coffee and sandwiches. I met a chief steward from my ship on leave from Southampton, England, and he told me that he always instructed his men to comply, even though he knew that what we were doing, because he never wanted to create a race issue. Sasha, it must have been awful for blacks to be serving in the Navy in those days. I used to wonder why the hell they ever joined. But I remember what the great boxing champion Joe Louis once said, "There may be many things wrong with America, but there is nothing here that a Hitler can fix." One day, in a very rough sea on the North Atlantic, a steward's mate spilled hot coffee on a white officer. The enraged officer slapped the steward with the back of his hand. The black sailor slapped the officer in return. No officer has the right to strike a crew member, but the steward was put in the ship's brig and later sent to a military prison. That incident probably could not be repeated today. Not that blacks are no longer discriminated against, but simply because Americans, black and white, are beginning to better understand and apply the Constitution that we are supposed to be living by. As I said, today there are many black officers in the Navy. I was so disappointed at myself sailing around on that ship, that segregated ship, as a closet Jew, supposedly fighting racism, anti-Semitism, and fascism while ignoring it on my own ship, that I finally decided to make everyone aboard know that I was a Jew. Sasha, when you said that the Nazis actually helped forge a previously divided Soviet people into one close union, I felt a twinge of envy. I do not mean that I envy the terrible suffering or the great sacrifices. It was a very high price that all of you paid. But we never did reach that stage. Even though the white middle class had the feeling of oneness after the war, there was an esoteric message of victory. We won the battle, but the question was, did we win the war against the philosophy of the enemy? The simple answer was, no, not really. The attitude here after the war was so different from that in the Soviet Union. Soldiers and sailors and flyers and Marines fought our war. They bled and died, but the majority of U.S. citizens enjoyed the war. That may sound like an awful thing to say, but it's true. There was sorrow for the dead and wounded, but the workers who had to endure the mental anguish and pain of the Depression were making more money than ever before. For the first time, women were welcomed into the workplace. Rich men got richer, and the poor had been pacified. No bombs or enemy troops landed on the continental United States. Nightclubs were filled, and prostitutes literally made fortunes. It was my ship that brought back the first victorious American soldiers from the European theater of war. I remember the celebration well. It lasted for almost 3 years. Sasha, you said that you were ashamed of the killing that you were forced to do during the war. I was ashamed because I could not feel the joy of victory that everyone else felt. I knew that I had an easy time of it, but the gnawing inside of me persisted. We satisfied our machismo, but never laid a glove on the real enemy. The old hatreds that had driven me into the service instead of college were still there. I knew they were there because I lived with them on each ship that I served on. I wore my uniform and my ribbons home and pretended that I had done something important. Perhaps I did, but I did not feel the same elation that others did at the end of the war. Following the Japanese surrender on board the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945, Americans found it easy to put the war behind them. The country hadn't changed all that much, they thought, ignoring the demographic changes that were the beginning of the black migration into the northern cities. The bars and nightclubs were filled every night. Returning veterans were paid $20 a week for 52 weeks. In post-war America, one person could almost get by on that. Many were given stipends to go back to school, and the government guaranteed loans to those veterans who could buy houses at low interest rates. We had just won another war to end all wars, and now Americans wanted to turn inward. They wanted to concentrate on family and washing machines and television sets for their new houses, which were being built faster than they could be counted. They wanted their children to have all of the things that they themselves dreamed about during the Depression and during the war. They did not want to think about politics. The fact that most Americans so easily embraced President Truman's explanation of why he dropped 2 nuclear bombs on civilians in Japan should have told us a great deal about the malignant racism that was to bring the nation to its knees in just 2 decades. Propaganda saturated Americans who continued to receive their daily ration of venom-dipped media reports about the wartime activities of the slant eyes or the Jews or the yellow hordes, found it easy to accept the rationale that Truman killed all these Japanese civilians to save American lives. The Japanese attacked our warships and air bases at Pearl Harbor. As dastardly as any act was, it was an act of war. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were acts of madness. Truman's proud announcement about the dropping of the bomb after he returned from his meeting with Stalin at Potsdam sent my father into a rage. He saw the dropping of the bomb as an anti-Soviet act more than an act in the war against Japan. To him, it was one of the worst acts of war, comparable to the massacre of the Jews in Belarus. He often referred to it as the crime of the century. Sasha, I cannot articulate the kind of anguish and frustration that your Uncle John had to bear during the war. When the first terrible reports came in about the Nazis overrunning his homeland, he was beside himself. That first day when the New York Times published a map showing all of Pinsk, he pointed to the Bug Canal, and with tears in his eyes, he told me that his father used to take him fishing there. He would wring his hands and mumble about the killing of civilians, and that war should be for soldiers to fight on a battlefield. He was always thinking about his family in Plotnica, and he felt so helpless. On July 7, 1946, I was just discharged from the United States Navy. That is to say, I was placed on inactive duty in the reserve. I was kept in the service a little longer than most of my shipmates, because I was chosen as part of the crew that would take the captured liner, the Europa, to France to help the French to reignite their tourism trade. Once a civilian, I planned to join the others who were continuing their education and enjoy the wonderful years of peace and prosperity that we all had been promised. I tried to pretend that I did not see what was happening to my country, and that the developing Cold War was just the last gasp of a few reactionary zealots. I attended a school for broadcasters and began a career that most men my age would have been more than satisfied with. I was at last in the mainstream of America, and it was in my plan to stay there. But in my next 2 letters, I will tell you how strong the genes of Gregoria are. Once again, my father pointed me toward the battlefield, and I landed with all of my being into the fight for human rights. The year 1948 was the year of reawakening for many liberal Americans who were jarred back into reality by the voice of Henry Agard Wallace. Please, Sasha, convey to Luba the love that all of us here feel for her. Her story moved us all. I am most anxious to hear what happened to you when the Nazis invaded and what happened to the rest of the family. With love from all of us here, I remain, your cousin David. And I know that that's a relatively short chapter. The next chapter, however, is very, very long, and it takes us back into the Soviet occupation in Belarus. It's a very long, complicated chapter. I had discussed with Zena, and we decided that we're going to split it into 2 parts. So tomorrow I'll read Chapter 5, Part 1, and then on Friday I'll read Chapter 5, Part 2. And Zena had also mentioned the possibility of doing a question and answer segment. So you can talk about whether or not you'd like to do that. And I'm open to that if it's something you decide that you would like to do. Thank you.